The moon hung low over the city, casting long shadows on the cobblestone streets that led to the old museum. Nestled in the heart of a forgotten district, the museum had stood for centuries, its stone facade weathered by time, yet seemingly unyielding. Tonight, however, it would reveal a side of itself that the public had never seen before. The museum was holding a special event, its first ever midnight opening. Few people had even heard of it, and even fewer had been invited. Yet, despite its obscurity, the museum had managed to gather an exclusive crowd, curious souls who thought themselves daring enough to venture into the darkness for a unique experience. The curator, a gaunt man named Henry Greaves, had promised an evening of unparalleled intrigue. He claimed that the exhibits, ordinarily locked behind glass and guarded by mundane barriers of time, would come to life at midnight, revealing their hidden histories. These objects, some said to be cursed, others purported to be enchanted, were shrouded in secrets that the public had never been privy to. For most of the attendees, the allure of uncovering these secrets outweighed the unsettling rumors that had been circulating about the museum. Among the guests was Elise, a young historian specializing in antique artifacts. She had spent much of her career studying the obscure, the forgotten relics of history that most people would never see, let alone understand. Elise had heard whispers about the museum's mysterious past, its previous curators who had vanished, its collection of rare and esoteric items. But it was only the tantalizing promise of gaining access to these uncharted relics that had lured her here tonight. She had arrived early, eager to be among the first to experience the event. As the clock struck 11, the doors creaked open, and the museum staff ushered the guests into the grand lobby. The dimly lit room was filled with the faint scent of old wood and dust, an aroma that seemed to suffuse every inch of the building. The walls were adorned with portraits of long-dead figures, their eyes following the guests as they moved. Elise could feel the weight of the past pressing in on her, an odd sensation she couldn't quite place. It was as if the very building was watching them, waiting for something. The guests were led through a narrow corridor, and as they passed, the objects on display seemed to shift in the dim light. Elise couldn't shake the feeling that the museum was alive, its artifacts subtly reacting to their presence. A painting she had passed earlier, an unsettling portrait of a woman with hollow eyes, now seemed to be positioned at a slightly different angle. Elise paused for a moment, her hand brushing the side of a dusty display case. But before she could dwell on the sensation, a loud chime echoed throughout the building. Midnight. The air grew heavier, almost as though the atmosphere itself had changed. The curator appeared, his thin, pale face illuminated by the flickering candlelight. He beckoned them into the next room, a gallery that had always intrigued Elise from afar. It was home to the museum's most coveted exhibits, artifacts that were said to be imbued with strange powers. Some of the objects, including a delicate glass mirror and an intricately carved wooden box, were believed to have been passed down through generations, their origins obscured by time. But what caught Elise's attention was the old, worn book resting in the center of the room. Henry Greaves began to speak, his voice low and deliberate. This, my dear guests, is the heart of our collection. The objects here are not mere relics. They are the echoes of the past, relics of lives long forgotten, lives that have left their marks on the world in ways we cannot fully understand. As he spoke, Elise found herself drawn to the book, its pages yellowed with age, yet oddly preserved. Something about it felt alive. Her curiosity got the better of her, and she stepped closer to the book, ignoring the creeping discomfort that now settled in her chest. The curator's voice seemed to fade into the background as she reached out to touch the cover. Her fingers brushed against the leather-bound surface, and in that instant, the room seemed to shift. The air grew colder, and the light from the candles flickered wildly. A low hum, almost imperceptible at first, grew louder, vibrating the very floor beneath her feet. Suddenly, a loud crash echoed through the museum, followed by a series of sharp, rapid footsteps. Elise spun around, her heart racing, but the others in the room seemed unfazed. as if they hadn't heard it at all. The curator, however, looked visibly shaken. He muttered something under his breath, his eyes flickering nervously from one corner of the room to another. It was clear that something was wrong. "We must move on," Henry Greaves said, his voice strained. "The objects have been waiting, and we cannot keep them waiting any longer." His words felt forced, as though he were trying to convince himself just as much as he was trying to convince the guests. But as Elise followed him out of the room, she couldn't shake the feeling that something had changed. The building itself felt different, as though it had awakened from a long slumber. The whispers that had once seemed like figments of her imagination now felt all too real. The air was thick with anticipation, and the ground beneath her feet seemed to pulse with an unsettling energy. Something was coming. Elise could feel it, and it was no longer a secret that the museum had been hiding. As the guests followed Henry Greaves deeper into the museum, Elise's unease continued to grow. The corridors seemed longer than before, the walls too close, and the dim lighting cast long, sinister shadows that moved as if they had a life of their own. The museum, once an inert collection of objects, had transformed into something altogether more unsettling. Every artifact, every exhibit, now seemed to pulse with a latent energy that hung thick in the air. Elise couldn't shake the feeling that they were not alone. This was no ordinary museum, and these were no ordinary exhibits. Greaves led the group into a small, intimate room that seemed to have been deliberately hidden away from the public eye. The walls were lined with curious objects, strange idols, faded tapestries, and an assortment of books that looked as though they had been untouched for decades. But it was not these objects that caught Elise's attention. In the center of the room stood a large, antique cabinet, its surface intricately carved with patterns that seemed to shift in the half-light. It was closed, but the air around it seemed charged with anticipation. "This," Greaves began, his voice trembling ever so slightly, "is the centerpiece of tonight's event. Few have seen it, and fewer still have lived to tell the tale." The room fell silent, the guests leaning in, eager for the revelation of what lay within. Elise felt a chill crawl up her spine. She had been in countless museums, seen countless exhibits, but there was something about this one that felt different. Something darker. Greaves seemed to hesitate, his fingers brushing against the cabinet's surface as though he were testing something, ensuring it was safe to open. His eyes darted nervously around the room before he spoke again, his tone barely above a whisper. "This is the Cabinet of Echoes," he said. "Inside it is an object unlike any other. It is said to contain the essence of those who have touched it, those who have become intertwined with the museum's history." He paused, eyes narrowing. "It is an artifact of power, and it must be handled with caution." Elise stepped forward, her curiosity getting the best of her. "What exactly does it do?" she asked, her voice laced with skepticism. She could sense that there was more to the curator's words than he was letting on, but he was not willing to share it freely. Greaves' expression darkened. "It is not what it does, but what it is. The cabinet does not hold a single object. It holds countless fragments of history, echoes of the people who have been here, of the things they left behind." His voice grew more intense, as though the weight of the words was pulling him in. "It is a collection of memories, and it has a way of calling to those who are sensitive to its presence." Elise felt a cold shiver run down her spine. She could sense that the curator was hiding something, but what? She glanced at the other guests. They too seemed uneasy, their faces pale as they looked from Greaves to the cabinet, their fascination now tinged with fear. Something was not right, and the longer Elise stayed, the more she could feel the pull of the museum's strange aura. Before she could ask another question, Greaves took a step forward, his hands trembling as he unlocked the cabinet. The low hum that had been building in the museum seemed to intensify, vibrating through the floor, the walls, and even Elise's bones. For a moment, nothing happened, and then the cabinet doors creaked open slowly, revealing nothing but darkness within. But that darkness wasn't empty. There was something inside it, something that couldn't be seen, but could certainly be felt. A rush of memories assaulted Elise. She saw flashes of faces she didn't recognize, heard disjointed whispers, and felt an overwhelming sense of loss. Her hand flew to her mouth as her body trembled, and for a split second, she thought she might lose control. But then, as quickly as it had begun, the sensation stopped. She blinked, disoriented, and the cabinet was empty once again. The humming ceased, the air grew still, and the room fell silent. Greaves closed the cabinet with a soft click, his face pale and drawn. "It is not something you can comprehend with mere logic or reason," he murmured. "The Cabinet of Echoes does not simply contain memories. It traps them. It binds them to this place." He turned his eyes to the guests, his gaze darkening. "You may not realize it, but each of you is now a part of this collection. You've left a trace of yourselves here, just as those before you have." The room seemed to shrink around them as the weight of Greaves' words sank in. Elise's heart pounded in her chest as she processed what he had just revealed. Each of them was now connected to the museum in some inescapable way, their lives intertwined with its cursed history. And what's more, they were trapped here, whether they understood it or not. As the group began to murmur nervously, Elise's mind raced. She had to leave. She had to get out before the museum claimed her as it had claimed so many others. But as she turned to make her way back to the entrance, she found the door she had come through no longer there. Instead, the walls were closed in, and the only way out was deeper into the museum, deeper into the darkness that now seemed to pulse from the very walls. The Cabinet of Echoes had just begun its work. The silence that followed the closing of the Cabinet of Echoes felt oppressive. The guests were still processing Greaves' words, some attempting to rationalize what had just happened, while others, like Elise, found themselves wrestling with an insidious, creeping sense of dread. The curator's warnings had struck Elise to her core, and now, the museum seemed to pulse with an energy that was almost palpable. As the other guests lingered in nervous curiosity, Elise instinctively took a step back, away from the now-closed cabinet. Her body felt stiff, her heart beating erratically, and yet, despite the desire to flee, something held her in place. Greaves, for all his earlier discomfort, now appeared oddly composed. He wiped his hands on his trousers before addressing the crowd once again. "I understand that you all have questions," he said, his voice tight, "but I must ask that you refrain from asking them for now. The objects here are not for casual observation. They demand respect. We must move forward. There is more to this night than the Cabinet of Echoes." Elise wanted to protest, to voice the thousands of questions swirling in her mind, but she couldn't bring herself to do it. The tension in the air had become unbearable, and there was a sinking feeling in her stomach that told her it was best to stay silent. It was as if the museum itself was listening, waiting for something. Her gaze flicked around the room, but the other guests were still too stunned, too hesitant to speak. Greaves beckoned them deeper into the museum, his movements deliberate, as though he had done this many times before. Elise noticed that his eyes no longer met theirs directly. Instead, he kept them lowered, glancing nervously at the shadows that seemed to stretch unnaturally along the walls. "Follow me," he commanded, his voice firmer now, though the slight tremor was still detectable. The group moved forward in silence, with Elise at the rear, her steps growing heavier with each passing moment. She glanced at the other artifacts on display as they walked, some of them familiar, others seemingly out of place, as though they had no right to be here. She couldn't help but feel that each object in the museum was linked to something more sinister than its surface appearance suggested. The tension in her chest grew tighter with each step they took. They arrived at a narrow hallway that led to a set of stairs descending into the lower levels of the museum. The air grew colder as they descended, and Elise felt an overwhelming sense of claustrophobia. The walls seemed to close in, and the air felt thick, stifling. It was as though the museum itself were drawing them in, pulling them toward an inevitable end. Elise's instincts screamed at her to turn back, but something, perhaps a morbid curiosity or a sense of obligation, kept her moving forward. At the bottom of the stairs, Greaves stopped before a door that appeared even older than the rest of the museum. It was made of heavy wood, dark with age, and adorned with strange carvings that Elise had never seen before. The markings seemed to shift in the flickering light, as if they were alive, moving subtly with each breath of air. Elise's throat tightened as she realized she had seen similar symbols etched into the cabinet they had just left. "This," Greaves said in a low voice, his tone heavy with significance, "is the heart of the museum. It is where the oldest and most dangerous artifacts are kept. Here, the objects are not simply relics of the past. They are alive. They are imbued with forces beyond human comprehension, and they must be carefully contained." The door creaked open, and the group stepped into a large, dimly lit room. At first, Elise couldn't make out much in the darkness, but as her eyes adjusted, she saw that the room was filled with glass cases, each one containing strange and unsettling items. Among the artifacts were old, tattered scrolls, jars filled with what appeared to be preserved human remains, and a series of paintings that seemed to depict scenes of violence and decay. It was as though the room itself were a tomb, and each item inside it a witness to some long-forgotten horror. Greaves turned to the group, his face pale in the low light. "These objects," he said quietly, "are the true treasures of the museum. They are not simply old. They are cursed." His voice dropped even lower. "And they are waiting." A chill ran down Elise's spine as she realized that the curator was not merely describing these items in academic terms. There was genuine fear in his voice, a fear that seemed to stem from something deeper than his mere knowledge of their histories. It was as though Greaves had lived with these objects long enough to understand their true nature, and in doing so, had come to realize that they could not be controlled. Suddenly, Elise felt it, a faint whisper, barely audible, but unmistakable. It came from behind her, in the direction of the largest glass case. She turned quickly, expecting to see someone standing behind her, but there was nothing. The room was empty save for the guests, Greaves, and the relics around them. Yet the whispering continued, soft at first, then rising in intensity. The words were unintelligible, distorted as if coming from far away, but they carried an unmistakable sense of urgency. Her heart raced, and she found herself drawn toward the source of the sound, unable to look away. The whispering grew louder, and as she moved closer to the glass case, she could see faint shapes shifting inside, barely visible through the murky glass. It was as though something was struggling to get out. Greaves stepped forward, his hand trembling as he placed it on the case. His voice was strained as he spoke again, this time with a sense of finality. "You must never let them out. Once they are free, there is no going back." His eyes flickered to the group, and Elise could see the deep fear in his gaze. They are not just objects. They are the remnants of something else, something that should never have been brought into this world. The air in the room grew heavier, and Elise felt an almost suffocating pressure in her chest. The whispers intensified, now growing into low, guttural murmurs, as if the very walls of the museum were speaking to her, urging her to unlock the secrets within. Elise felt the weight of the museum's curse settle over her, and for the first time, she wondered if the night would ever end. Would they leave this place? Or would they, too, become part of the museum's haunted history? Something was coming, and Elise was beginning to realize that whatever it was already inside them. As the group stood there, in the shadowy depths of the museum's heart, Elise could feel a shift in the atmosphere. The oppressive silence that had previously enveloped the room had been replaced by something much darker, an unseen presence that seemed to press against her skin, whispering through the very fabric of the air. The more she tried to dismiss it as her imagination running wild, the more the sensation intensified. It was as if the walls themselves were alive, watching, waiting. Greaves stood before them, rigid, his pale face illuminated by the flickering light of the single overhead bulb. His eyes darted from one guest to another, but he didn't seem to make contact for too long, as though avoiding looking directly at anyone for fear of what he might see in their faces. Elise tried to steady herself, to focus on his words, but the sensation of something lurking just beyond her vision was too much to ignore. The soft, unintelligible whispers had grown louder, more distinct, and they seemed to be coming from every direction. It was then that Elise noticed something peculiar. As her eyes shifted from the case in front of her to the surrounding walls, she could see faint shadows flickering in the corners of her vision. At first, She dismissed it as a trick of the light, the uneven bulb overhead casting strange shapes in the darkness. But as she looked more closely, she realized that these shadows were not simply shadows. They moved, subtly, impossibly, as if alive. Her stomach tightened in response, her feet frozen in place. Something in her gut told her that the museum, this room in particular, was no longer just a place of history. It was a living entity in itself. Greaves cleared his throat, his voice shaking slightly as he spoke again, breaking the silence that had stretched on for what felt like an eternity. "These objects," he said, "they were never meant to be here. They should never have been brought into this world. There are things in this room that should not be, and there are others still that you can never truly see." He paused, his gaze sweeping across the group. "It is not just the objects that are dangerous. It is the space they inhabit, and the space inhabits us." The gravity of his words hit Elise like a physical blow. She found herself unable to respond, unable to speak, as though the very act of speaking might disturb something in the room. The whispers had stopped, but the air remained heavy, thick with the weight of something unseen. It was as though the museum itself had heard Greaves' words, and in response, the atmosphere seemed to tighten, coiling like a spring ready to snap. The door behind them suddenly slammed shut, so forcefully that it shook the room. The sound echoed in their ears, reverberating through the walls. Elise's heart jumped in her chest. She spun toward the door, her breath coming in shallow gasps. She wasn't sure whether the sound was real, or if it had simply been a manifestation of her fear. But in that moment, she knew that something had changed. Something had broken the delicate balance of the museum, and now they were trapped within its dark embrace. Greaves looked over his shoulder at the closed door, his expression unreadable. "We cannot leave," he said quietly, almost to himself. "At least not until we understand the nature of the force we've awakened." The group exchanged nervous glances, each of them caught between the desire to flee and the inexplicable pull to stay. But none of them spoke. It was as though some silent understanding had passed between them, an unspoken agreement that leaving was not an option. Not yet. Elise, despite her growing terror, found herself rooted to the spot, her body refusing to move. The whispers, now faint but persistent, seemed to be calling to her. Greaves motioned toward the far corner of the room, where a narrow, stone staircase spiraled downward into even darker depths. "There is one last part of the museum," he said, his voice soft but tinged with a certain finality. "One last place where the full truth can be revealed. I cannot guide you any further. The rest is up to you." A chill ran down Elise's spine. She couldn't explain why, but something about the staircase felt wrong. The air around it seemed colder, denser, as though the very space had become tainted. And yet, she knew instinctively that they had no choice. They had to follow Greaves into whatever lay beyond that staircase. There was no turning back now. The group, though hesitant, began to shuffle toward the staircase, moving in a half-dazed manner. It was as if each of them was being drawn in by some invisible force, a magnetic pull that kept them tethered to the darkness. Elise's legs felt like lead, but she took one step forward, then another, her breath shallow as she tried to calm the panic rising in her chest. The darkness of the staircase consumed them as they descended, and Elise's mind raced with thoughts of what could be waiting in the depths of the museum. Greaves had spoken of forces beyond comprehension, things that could not be seen, but were most certainly present. She wondered what would happen once they reached the bottom. Would they find the answers they were seeking? Or would they find themselves facing something far worse? The further down they went, the more the air seemed to thicken. It became harder to breathe, and Elise felt a deep, unsettling pressure building in her chest. She reached out instinctively to steady herself against the cold stone wall, but as her fingers brushed against it, she felt an odd vibration, faint at first, then growing stronger. It was as if the very walls of the museum were alive, pulsing with some dark, ancient energy. A shiver ran through her body as the sensation intensified. When they finally reached the bottom, the room before them was darker than any place they had yet encountered. The only source of light came from a flickering torch on the far wall, casting long shadows that stretched across the floor like the hands of some unseen beast. Elise stepped forward cautiously, her heart hammering in her chest. She could feel the weight of the museum's dark secrets pressing down on her, and she realized with a cold shiver that the true horrors of the night had only just begun. In that moment, Elise understood whatever this place was, it was not just a museum. It was a prison, and they were the prisoners. As the last of the group shuffled down the stone staircase, Elise's senses heightened to a level that made every creak of the stone beneath their feet sound like a booming echo in the otherwise oppressive silence. The air down here was thick with something else, something ancient and heavy. She could barely make out the faint outline of the room ahead, but the flickering torchlight cast just enough illumination to reveal more of the decaying walls, the carvings etched deep into their surface, and a collection of objects that seemed to pulse with an eerie energy of their own. Greaves led them into the room without a word, his steps calculated and steady, as though he had walked this path countless times before. Elise noticed how his gaze darted nervously around the room, lingering on some of the objects as though afraid they might come to life at any moment. For a fleeting second, she wondered if he had been here before, not just in this room, but within the very walls of the museum itself. Perhaps this was not just a place he worked in, but a place he had been trapped in for far longer than any of them realized. The room, as it came into full view, seemed almost like an altar. At its center stood a massive stone pedestal, carved with symbols that twisted and bent in impossible ways, some forming intricate, almost unrecognizable patterns. Surrounding the pedestal were dozens of artifacts, items that looked as though they were pulled from forgotten tombs and ancient ruins. Each one had its own aura, its own haunting presence, but the pedestal was the focal point. Elise felt the pull of it, an inexplicable gravity that seemed to sink into the pit of her stomach. These, Greaves whispered hoarsely, are not just artifacts. They are anchors. His words hung in the air, reverberating in the stillness of the room. They tie this place to the realms beyond, realms where no human should venture. Elise, despite the gnawing fear that clung to her, stepped closer to the pedestal. There was something about it, something undeniable, that called to her. She could feel the energy thrumming in the air, thick and oppressive, and for a moment, she wondered if she had made a mistake in coming down here. But there was no turning back now. She had to understand what was happening, what Greaves was talking about, and more importantly, why she felt so drawn to this cursed space. The others lingered at the edges of the room, their faces pale in the torchlight, as though they, too, could sense the wrongness in the air. No one spoke. The only sounds were the distant whispers that seemed to echo from all directions. Elise reached out, her fingers trembling as they brushed against the stone pedestal. The moment her skin made contact, a sharp, searing pain shot through her arm, and her vision blurred with a dark mist. She gasped, stumbling backward, the sensation of cold fire still creeping up her arm. "I told you," Greaves said softly, but with an unsettling calm. "The artifacts here are bound to ancient powers, forces we cannot begin to comprehend." The pedestal, he paused, his voice dropping to a whisper. "It is the key to waking them." The words hit Elise like a blow. She backed away from the pedestal, her pulse racing. She now understood. The museum wasn't just a collection of old things. It was a vessel containing forces that should never have been disturbed. As she looked around at the objects, she realized they were not just relics of the past. They were links to something darker, older, and far more dangerous than anything she had imagined. A low rumbling sound reverberated through the room, making the floor beneath their feet tremble. Elise's heart skipped a beat. It felt as if the very foundations of the museum were shaking, as though something deep within it had been disturbed. The room seemed to darken, the shadows stretching unnaturally, and Elise could feel her body growing colder with every passing second. The whispers had returned, louder now, more distinct, filling her mind with incomprehensible voices. She could hear phrases, names, ancient words that seemed to slither through her thoughts, just beyond the reach of understanding. Suddenly, the pedestal glowed, A faint, sickly green light emanated from the cracks in the stone. Elise's breath caught in her throat as she watched, transfixed, as the objects surrounding it seemed to respond. They shook, vibrating violently on their pedestals, as though they were alive. The sound of grinding stone filled the air, and the artifacts began to levitate, lifting just an inch above their resting places before crashing back down with an unnatural force. "Get away from it!" Greaves shouted, his voice suddenly strained with panic. But it was too late. The room erupted into chaos. The air grew thick with the stench of decay, and the floor beneath them began to warp and bend. Elise felt herself pulled toward the pedestal, her feet moving of their own accord, her body unwilling to obey her desperate commands. It was as if the force within the room had locked onto her, and it would not let go. A vision slammed into her mind. Dark, twisting shapes that loomed over her, their forms shifting between solid and formless, their eyes, if they could be called eyes, burning with an ancient hunger. They were the ones who had been speaking to her, the ones who had been waiting. And now, they were awakening. The artifacts, the pedestal, the very museum itself. It was all a trap, a ritual waiting to complete itself. With a violent jerk, Elise broke free from the pull, stumbling backward into the others. They were all wide-eyed with fear, but none of them moved, as if paralyzed by the weight of the darkness that filled the room. The whispers had become a deafening cacophony, filling the air with incoherent words that twisted in Elise's mind. She wanted to scream, to run, but her body refused to obey. Then, with a deafening crash, the pedestal shattered. The ground shook violently as the artifacts around them exploded into the air, pieces of stone, wood, and metal flying in every direction. And in the center of it all, the green light intensified, blinding in its brilliance, and for a brief moment, Elise saw the truth. The museum had been waiting for this moment, waiting for them, waiting for the final push that would release the darkness into the world. And with that final, terrible flash, everything went black. The world felt strangely muted as Elise's consciousness slowly returned. The overwhelming sensation of weightlessness was the first thing she noticed, like she was floating in a void. Her body felt heavy, but light at the same time, as though she were caught between two realms, neither fully alive nor fully dead. When her eyes opened, the room was gone, replaced by an eerie blackness that stretched endlessly in every direction. Her breath came in ragged gasps, her mind still hazy with the remnants of the vision, the flickering images of darkness, of creatures that were not meant to be seen, clawing at the edges of her thoughts. For a long moment, she thought she might still be dreaming, but the cold sweat that clung to her skin and the sharp thud of her heartbeat told her otherwise. There was something terribly wrong with this place, and in the absence of the museum's walls, Elise couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching her, just out of sight. She turned her head, scanning the void, but there was no sign of the others. No trace of Greaves, no evidence of the pedestal or the artifacts. It was as if the world had swallowed them whole, leaving only the silence of an infinite, impenetrable darkness. Suddenly, a low, rumbling noise echoed from somewhere beyond her perception. It wasn't the same as before, when the artifacts had shaken in unison. This was a sound that seemed to vibrate through her very bones, resonating in the deepest recesses of her mind. She flinched, the sensation crawling beneath her skin. The darkness pulsed with the rhythm of it, as though it were alive. Her heart raced, but there was nowhere to run. The force that had driven her into this otherworldly place had made sure of that. As the rumbling grew louder, Elise felt the hairs on her neck stand on end. A cold breath, almost like a whisper, brushed against her ear. She spun around, but still, there was nothing but the oppressive, suffocating void. And yet, the feeling that something was there, something close and unseen, only intensified. It was as though a hand was just beyond her reach, brushing against the fabric of the air itself, playing with her senses, guiding her in a direction she couldn't understand. Her mind raced with questions, with a deep and unrelenting fear. Where were they? Where was Greaves? What had happened to the room? to the museum. Was this the aftermath of the ritual? The awakening of something far older, far more dangerous than anything she could have imagined? And more importantly, was this place real, or was it some kind of twisted manifestation born from the artifact's power? Was she trapped in a nightmare that had no end? Without warning, the darkness began to shift. At first, it was imperceptible, a faint ripple, like the surface of water disturbed by an unseen force. But then it became more pronounced, a slow, deliberate motion that spread across the void, pulling at the edges of her vision. Elise felt herself being drawn toward it, her feet moving before her mind could catch up. She tried to resist, to force herself to stay still, but it was as if her body was no longer her own. The invisible hand, the one that had been guiding her, pushing her, was now dragging her into the heart of the unknown. The world around her began to twist, folding in on itself, as if the very fabric of reality were being unraveled. Elise closed her eyes, but the visions only grew stronger. She saw flashes of the museum's halls, of objects she didn't recognize, and then the twisted faces of figures she had never met. They seemed familiar, and yet alien, their eyes glowing with that same otherworldly light that had filled the room with the pedestal. They reached out to her, their fingers stretching into the blackness, calling her name with voices that were not her own. And then, just as suddenly as it had begun, the darkness receded. Elise found herself standing, or rather stumbling, in a place that felt much too real to be a mere vision. The ground beneath her feet was solid, cold stone, and the air was thick with the scent of mildew and old dust. She blinked, trying to orient herself, her mind still reeling from what she had just experienced. The museum? No, this wasn't the museum. She was no longer in the stone chamber beneath the building. Instead, she stood in what appeared to be a long, narrow hallway, stretching out before her into an unending darkness. The walls were adorned with cracked portraits and faded tapestries, their colors long since bled into nothingness. The flickering light from an old, rusted lantern cast long, wavering shadows along the walls, giving the entire space an unsettling atmosphere. It was a hallway that should have been forgotten, hidden away, like some relic of a past that had been buried too deep to remember. A chill ran down her spine as she stepped forward, her footsteps echoing in the silent corridor. She couldn't shake the feeling that she wasn't alone here, that something was watching her, following her every move. The silence pressed in on her, thick and oppressive, and every turn of her head seemed to reveal a new shadow in the corners of her vision. And then, out of the corner of her eye, she saw it. A figure, a silhouette, standing at the far end of the hallway. It was tall, looming, its features shrouded in darkness. Elise's breath caught in her throat as the figure remained perfectly still, its gaze locked onto her. She couldn't see its face, but she could feel its presence, a crushing weight in the air. The figure didn't move, didn't speak, but its presence was undeniable, suffocating. It was as if it had been waiting for her, waiting for this moment, for her to step into its domain. She took a tentative step forward, but the figure was gone. The hallway, once again, seemed empty. But Elise knew better now. She could still feel its gaze, still sense the darkness that hung over her like a shadow. She wasn't alone. She had never been alone. And whatever force had led her here, whatever hand had guided her down this path, was waiting for her to make the next move. The silence that had followed Elise's encounter with the figure at the end of the hallway was unlike any silence she had ever experienced. It was as though the very air around her had thickened, pressing in on her chest, suffocating her with its weight. The echo of her footsteps became louder, more oppressive, the longer she remained in that corridor. She felt the walls close in around her, and every shadow seemed to stretch, lurking, waiting. It was as if the building itself were alive, its heartbeat reverberating through the stone floor and up into her bones. Each step she took felt deliberate, as though the space around her was urging her onward. Yet, she couldn't shake the feeling that the walls themselves were whispering. The low murmurs, barely perceptible, seemed to float on the edges of her hearing. At first, She thought it was her mind playing tricks on her, a product of her fear and confusion. But then the whispers became more distinct, more insistent, and she found herself halting, her breath catching in her throat. Elise pressed her ear to the cold stone wall, straining to listen. The words were impossible to make out at first, but they were there, undeniably there. Soft voices woven together like a tapestry of secrets, murmuring in a language she did not understand. She stepped back, instinctively pulling away from the wall, as though the whispers themselves were reaching out to touch her, to pull her into the depths of whatever nightmare had claimed this place. The hair on the back of her neck stood on end, and her skin prickled with a sensation of unease. But despite her fear, she couldn't bring herself to turn back. The hall was the only path forward, and deep within her, Elise knew that she had no choice but to keep moving. The whispers, now louder and clearer, seemed to call to her, urging her to listen, to understand. The words were a puzzle, a key to something far greater than she could fathom. She felt an undeniable pull, like a thread woven into the fabric of her mind, guiding her deeper into the unknown. The hallway stretched out before her, its end still hidden in the darkness, but Elise was no longer focused on the distant light. The walls themselves had become the center of her attention. She reached out to touch one, her fingers brushing against the smooth, cool surface of the stone. The instant her skin made contact, the whispers escalated, a cacophony of voices suddenly filling the air around her. It was as though the very walls were alive with the memories of the past, their voices rising in a frenzy, their words now frantic and urgent. "What are you?" Elise whispered to the stone, her voice trembling with a mix of fear and curiosity. It was the only question that made sense in that moment. She couldn't explain it, couldn't understand why she felt so drawn to the walls, to the whispers that now swirled around her like an invisible storm. The stone beneath her fingers began to vibrate, a low hum that reverberated through her entire body. She pulled her hand away in shock, but the vibrations lingered, the hum now echoing in her chest. It was then that she saw it, the first sign of movement in the hallway since she had arrived. At the far end of the corridor, a faint glow began to pulse in the darkness. It was soft at first, like the flicker of a candle, but it grew brighter with each passing second, casting long shadows that twisted unnaturally along the walls. Elise's heart skipped a beat as she turned toward the light, her mind racing. The figure she had seen before, the one that had disappeared in the blink of an eye, was it tied to this light? Without thinking, she began to walk toward it. The whispers grew louder, their urgency mounting with every step she took. They were no longer soft murmurs in the background. Now, they were words, clear, sharp, almost tangible. They seemed to be speaking directly to her now, calling her by name, begging her to listen, to understand. The language was foreign, ancient even, but Elise felt an eerie sense of familiarity, as though she had heard it before, or perhaps as though it had always been a part of her. Her pulse quickened, and her skin grew cold as the glow intensified. It was no longer just a flickering light. It was now a full-on blaze, but the flames that radiated from it were not like any fire Elise had ever seen. The light was pure, almost blinding, but there was something unnatural about it. The glow seemed to burn without heat, casting no shadows, yet filling the entire hallway with its oppressive presence. It was as though the very air around her had become thick with energy, with something ancient, something far beyond her comprehension. As she drew closer, the glow began to take shape. Slowly, at first, as though it were forming out of the very fabric of the darkness. Elise's breath hitched when she saw it. There, standing before her, was the figure, the same silhouette she had seen earlier. But now it was no longer just a shadow. It had a form, a presence. Its features were still shrouded in that unearthly light, but Elise could feel its gaze on her, even if she could not see its eyes. It stood motionless, its shape almost otherworldly, as though it did not belong in this world at all. The whispers reached a crescendo as Elise came to a halt before the figure. She could feel the air around her grow thick, like the tension before a storm. The figure didn't move, didn't speak, but its presence was suffocating, pressing in on her, suffusing the space around them both. Elise's heart pounded in her chest as she stared at it, her mind screaming for her to run, to escape. But she couldn't move. It was as though the figure had taken root in her very soul, paralyzing her with its otherworldly power. In that moment, Elise realized something that sent a chill down her spine. This figure, this being, was not a mere observer. It was connected to the Whispers. It was tied to the museum, to the artifacts, to everything that had brought her here. And somehow, deep within her, she knew that this figure was the key to everything. If only she could unlock its meaning. But unlocking that meaning would come at a cost she was not sure she was ready to pay. The figure before Elise remained motionless, its ethereal form radiating an unsettling light that seemed to distort the very air around it. Elise's mind raced, her heart hammering against her chest as she stood frozen in place, unable to tear her gaze away from the apparition. The Whispers, once distant and fragmented, had now become a deafening chorus, their words slipping into her consciousness like fragments of a half-remembered dream. Despite the overwhelming fear that gripped her, Elise couldn't deny the pull, the magnetic force drawing her closer to this being, to this moment that felt like the cusp of revelation. The figure remained silent, its form neither advancing nor retreating. It was as though it was waiting, watching, observing her. The longer Elise stood before it, the more she felt an inexplicable connection growing between them. The Whispers seemed to intensify, their words now weaving together into something more coherent. Though she still couldn't understand the language, it felt strangely familiar, like the echoes of something buried deep within her own past, something she had long forgotten. Her mind swam with the thought, as though a veil was slowly lifting, revealing truths she was not ready to confront. Suddenly, a flash of memory surged within her, an image of her childhood, something buried deep in the recesses of her mind. She saw herself standing in a dimly lit room, a room not unlike the one she was in now. She was younger, perhaps no older than 7, and her mother was beside her, whispering something in a language that seemed to resonate with the same rhythm as the whispers she was hearing now. Elise's heart lurched as the memory faded, leaving only a lingering sense of unease. The connection was real, deeper than she could have imagined. This museum, this place, was not unfamiliar to her. It had been part of her life, part of her past, and yet she had no memory of how or why. The figure moved then, its form bending slightly, as though acknowledging her recognition. Its presence seemed to grow stronger, its light more intense, but it did not speak. The air around Elise became heavier, pressing in on her from all sides, and she realized with growing horror that the museum itself seemed to respond to the figure's presence. The walls, once quiet and lifeless, now seemed to hum with a strange energy, their surfaces alive with whispered secrets, as though the museum itself were waking from a long slumber. Elise took a cautious step forward, the ground beneath her feet seeming to pulse with the same rhythm as the whispers. The figure did not stop her, and though fear gnawed at her, she found herself compelled to move closer, her body acting on its own, as though some unseen force was guiding her. The figure remained still, but its presence grew more tangible, more oppressive, as though the air around her thickened with the weight of centuries. It was no longer just a shape or a shadow. It had become a force, a presence that existed outside of time, outside of everything she had ever known. As Elise closed the distance between them, she could feel the temperature drop, a chill that seeped into her bones and made her breath visible in the cold air. The whispers, once distant, now felt like they were coming from all around her, as if the walls themselves were speaking directly to her. They grew louder, more insistent, pressing in her mind, forcing her to listen. But the more she tried to concentrate on them, the more fragmented they became, as though they were intentionally slipping away from her grasp. She could feel herself being pulled deeper into the museum, deeper into the history that it held, a history that was beginning to feel far too personal. Then, with a suddenness that took her breath away, the figure raised its hand. Elise froze, her heart pounding in her chest as the figure's fingers moved in slow, deliberate gestures. Each motion seemed to carry a weight, a power that reverberated in the air around her. As the figure's hand reached its apex, a sharp, resonant sound rang out from the walls, a single note that vibrated through her entire body. The whispers ceased abruptly, leaving only the lingering hum of that note, an unspoken command that seemed to reach into the very core of her being. Before she could react, the walls seemed to shift. The museum itself groaned as though it were awakening, its ancient structure reacting to the figure's call. Elise stepped back in alarm as the space around her began to distort. The walls stretched, warped, and twisted, as if the very dimensions of the museum were bending, warping, folding inward. The once familiar corridor dissolved into darkness, replaced by endless hallways that spiraled off into unseen corners, each one darker than the last. It was as though the museum itself had come alive, reshaping itself to fit the needs of the entity that stood before her. The figure's hand fell, and the air seemed to snap back into place. The distortion halted, but the effect lingered. Elise felt disoriented, as though the very ground beneath her feet was unstable, shifting. She looked around, her breath quick and shallow, her pulse racing. The museum was no longer the place she had entered. It had become something else entirely, something older, something driven by forces she did not understand. The figure's presence was overwhelming, suffocating, and yet Elise knew that it was not the figure itself that held the true power. It was the museum, the history, the very fabric of this place that had come alive in response to the figure's awakening. The whispers returned, but they were different now. No longer a disjointed chorus. They were more unified, more coherent. They spoke of a past that was far older than Elise had ever imagined. She could sense, with chilling certainty, that the museum was not merely a building. It was a living repository of ancient memories, of forgotten knowledge, and dark secrets. Secrets that had been buried deep within its walls, waiting for someone like her to uncover them. As the realization hit, Elise felt the weight of her situation settle on her. She was no longer just a visitor in this museum. She was a part of its story, entangled in the web of its past. And the figure, this being that stood before her, was not a mere guardian. It was a guide, a keeper of the history that she had unknowingly inherited. The whispers, the distortions, the very museum itself. All of it had been drawing her in, preparing her for something far greater than she could have imagined. Elise took a deep breath, her hands trembling as she braced herself for the truth that was yet to be revealed. The museum had not just chosen her to be a witness. It had chosen her to be a participant in its long-forgotten story, a story that was now awakening from the shadows. And whether she was ready or not, she was about to become a part of it, just as the museum had always intended. The figure that stood before Elise no longer seemed merely a supernatural presence, but rather an embodiment of the museum itself, its ancient, unyielding essence. The walls, the exhibits, even the dust floating in the still air, all seemed to pulse in rhythm with the figure's movements. It was as though the entire museum had become a living organism, responding to something far beyond her understanding. Every inch of the museum felt like it was alive, and Elise felt her sense of reality beginning to slip, like the edges of a dream fading with each passing moment. The coldness that had enveloped her earlier intensified, sinking deep into her bones. She had crossed a threshold, and there was no turning back. The whispers that had once surrounded her now seemed to echo from all directions, reverberating in the very marrow of her bones. They were no longer just voices. They were sensations, emotions, flashes of images, memories that felt both unfamiliar and achingly close. At times, Elise could almost swear she recognized certain faces, though they were not faces she had seen in years, if ever at all. They came to her as fleeting visions, faces twisted in fear or agony, eyes wide with what could only be described as desperate longing. And then they were gone, just as quickly as they had appeared. She shuddered and tried to focus, but the museum was shifting around her in such a way that concentrating became nearly impossible. Every step she took seemed to deepen her connection to the space, to the oppressive force that now surrounded her. The museum structure was no longer a simple collection of walls and artifacts. It had transformed into something much more profound, more ancient. Elise's eyes darted around the room, trying to grasp some semblance of logic, but there was none to be found. The hallway she had entered no longer led where it should have. In fact, none of the rooms did. The paths twisted and spiraled, folding into one another in impossible ways, as though time itself had unraveled. She wondered for a moment if she was trapped in a maze of her own mind, but the figure, the being that she could not understand, seemed to lead her forward, ever deeper into the heart of the museum. There was a door at the far end of the corridor, its dark frame almost invisible in the dim light. Elise's feet moved toward it as if guided by some unseen force. The closer she got, the more distinct the voices became. It was as though the museum was calling her, its ancient voice insistent, desperate, pulling at her from within the walls. Her breath became shallow, but she couldn't stop herself. It was as though the door was the key to understanding everything, the final piece in a puzzle she didn't even know she was meant to solve. She reached for the door handle, her fingers trembling, her pulse thudding in her ears. The moment her hand touched the cold brass handle, a sharp, deafening noise echoed through the air. It was the sound of something breaking, something ancient, something fragile. Elise recoiled instinctively, but the noise continued, growing louder, more overwhelming, until she thought her mind might snap under the pressure. It was as if time itself had fractured, and the pieces of the past and future were colliding, merging, blending into one. The voices intensified, no longer mere whispers but full-throated cries, shouts of anguish and despair. And then, suddenly, it stopped. Silence. In the silence, Elise stood frozen. The air around her seemed to hold its breath. The door was now open, but it was no longer just a doorway. It was a rift, a tear in the very fabric of reality. She could see beyond it, see the endless expanse of what looked like an ancient library. But this was no ordinary library. It stretched on into infinity, its shelves stacked high with countless volumes that appeared to stretch forever, their spines covered in a language she couldn't recognize. The air was thick with dust, yet the books seemed untouched by time itself. Elise felt a deep compulsion to step through, to enter the vast labyrinth of knowledge, but a deep fear held her back. The figure, still hovering near her, gestured for her to enter. Its movements were slow, deliberate, as though it understood the weight of the decision she faced. Elise's heart raced. The whispers, now silent once more, were replaced by a hum that reverberated through the space, as though the museum was breathing, pulsing with a life of its own. She had no choice now. This was the next step, whether she was ready for it or not. As she stepped forward, the air seemed to thicken, becoming heavier with each movement. The library loomed before her, its shelves like silent sentinels guarding the secrets of the past. She stepped through the doorway, her feet feeling as though they were sinking into the very ground beneath her. Each step felt like a step further into a deeper, darker abyss, but her mind was fixed on one question. What was this place? What was it that she was meant to find here? The figure did not follow her. It remained standing at the threshold, its presence still palpable, but distant now. Elise felt a strange sense of loneliness, as though she had been abandoned. The vast library stretched endlessly before her, and with each passing moment, she felt herself slipping further into its grip, losing herself to the maze of knowledge it contained. The shelves seemed to move of their own accord, shifting, rearranging, presenting new rows of books that had not been there moments before. Some were pristine, untouched by time, while others were worn and brittle, their pages yellowed and torn. As Elise wandered deeper into the labyrinth, the overwhelming sense of the museum's power continued to press in on her. She could feel the eyes of the past upon her, the weight of every forgotten soul that had passed through these walls, leaving behind only their memories and their secrets. The voices began to return, not as whispers this time, but as a low murmur that echoed through the aisles of the library. It was no longer the sound of many voices, but one voice that seemed to call to her specifically, as though it knew her, as though it had always known her. The voice spoke her name, Elise. Her body froze, the air thick with the sensation of something ancient, something far beyond her comprehension. The voice was familiar, yet alien, a presence that seemed to fill every corner of the library, every shadow. Elise turned in every direction, but there was no one there. The voice continued, its words insistent. "Find the truth," it urged. "It's the only way to stop it." Her mind reeled at the words. What truth? And what was it that she had to stop? The answer hovered on the edge of her understanding, just beyond reach. But in that moment, Elise knew one thing with certainty. Whatever lay within the pages of these books, whatever secrets they held, it was not going to be something she could walk away from. And so she walked deeper into the labyrinth, knowing that she was no longer just a visitor in this museum. She was a part of its story now, a part of something much larger, something that would shape her future in ways she could not yet comprehend. As Elise moved deeper into the library, the air grew colder, and a sense of foreboding settled over her like a heavy cloak. The shelves stretched on for what seemed like eternity, filled with countless books. Some were ancient tomes, their leather covers cracked and faded, while others were newer, almost out of place in the centuries-old setting. It was as if time itself had forgotten this place. Caught between the past and the future, an inescapable void that seemed to absorb everything around it. Each book she passed whispered faintly, as if calling her name, urging her to open them. But she didn't dare. The weight of their silence was too overwhelming. The voice that had spoken her name echoed in her mind again, and for a moment, Elise wondered if she was losing her grip on reality. Had the museum truly transformed into a living entity, or was it all a figment of her imagination? She reached out to touch a nearby book, its spine dusty and worn. As her fingers made contact, a shock ran through her, unlike anything she had ever felt. It was as though the very essence of the book had transferred into her, an ancient knowledge flooding her senses in a chaotic rush. The images, the voices, the forgotten stories, it all came at once, overwhelming her. She yanked her hand away, gasping for breath, but the sensation lingered. Panic rose in her chest as she stumbled backward, her heart pounding. She felt the walls close in around her, the library growing darker with each passing second. It was as though the museum itself was pressing against her, suffocating her, drawing her deeper into its labyrinth. But no matter how much she tried to retreat, the path behind her had vanished. The shelves seemed to close in on her, shifting like the maze was alive, leading her further and further into its heart. The whispers grew louder, and Elise realized they weren't just random voices anymore. They were words, distinct phrases repeating over and over, layering upon one another until they became a cacophony in her mind. "You must find the truth," they urged. "You must know the story." But which story? The history of the museum? Of the people who had come before her? Or something far older, something that had been buried for centuries? Elise couldn't answer. The only thing she knew for sure was that she had to keep moving forward. She could not stop. As she walked, her fingers brushing against the spines of books, she noticed something strange. Some of the titles weren't in any language she recognized. They were symbols, strange hieroglyphs that seemed to shift and change when she looked at them directly. Her mind struggled to comprehend the meaning behind them, but it was futile. The symbols danced in her vision, mocking her inability to grasp their meaning. The air was thick with the stench of decay, and Elise's throat tightened as she fought to breathe. The deeper she went, the darker it became. The once flickering light from the overhead lamps began to dim, as if the very energy that powered them was being drained. Shadows twisted and writhed in the corners, and Elise could no longer tell if they were just shadows or something more sinister. The figure she had seen earlier was nowhere to be found, but she could still feel its presence, looming just beyond her reach. It was as though the museum had become an entity in itself, feeding on her fear, growing stronger the more she succumbed to it. Suddenly, Elise stumbled upon something that made her stop in her tracks. It was a small alcove tucked away in the farthest corner of the library. Inside, there was a pedestal, and atop it lay a single book. Unlike the others, this book was pristine, its pages untouched by time, its cover gleaming as though it had been placed there just moments ago. A strange pull tugged at Elise, urging her to approach it. She hesitated, but the allure of the book was too powerful to ignore. She stepped forward, each movement slow and deliberate, her hand outstretched toward it. As her fingers brushed the cover, the temperature in the room dropped even further, the air becoming painfully cold. The whispers intensified, and for a moment, Elise thought she could hear her own name, whispered softly, urgently, as if from a great distance. She hesitated, but her curiosity won over. She opened the book, and as the first page flipped over, she was flooded with a vision, a memory that was not her own. She was standing in the museum, but the building looked different. There were no signs of age or decay. It was vibrant, alive, and full of people. Elise felt a strange sense of familiarity, but she couldn't place it. The scene shifted, and suddenly, she was no longer just an observer. She was living the memory. She walked through the museum, her footsteps echoing in the grand halls. The walls were adorned with portraits, each one depicting faces Elise recognized. They were the faces from the voices she had heard, people from the past, long forgotten. As she walked, she saw them all, their eyes following her with an intensity that made her skin crawl. They were watching her, waiting for something, as if they knew she was the one who had come to unlock the truth. A sudden movement in the vision caught her attention. A figure, cloaked in shadow, approached her. It was the same figure that had appeared earlier, but it was different now, more solid, more real. It reached out to her, its hand hovering just inches from her face, and Elise felt an overwhelming sense of dread wash over her. She wanted to scream, to run, but she couldn't move. The figure's hand touched her, and in that instant, she felt something snap, something ancient and powerful, as if the very fabric of the universe had been torn open. The vision ended abruptly, and Elise was thrust back into the present. The book fell from her hands, the pages fluttering wildly, as though trying to escape her grasp. Her heart raced, and she gasped for air, feeling as though she had just been pulled from the depths of a nightmare. But the nightmare wasn't over. It had only just begun. The whispers grew louder, now a chorus of voices all around her, each one urging her to find the truth. The walls seemed to close in, the shadows reaching for her with unseen hands. Elise knew one thing with certainty. The truth was here, buried in the pages of the book, in the stories of the forgotten ones. But to uncover it, she would have to face what lay in the heart of the museum, a place where time had no meaning, and where the past and future collided in a never-ending cycle. She was no longer just a visitor. She was a part of the museum story now, and there was no turning back. Elise stood frozen in the alcove, her breath coming in sharp gasps, as the book that had once held such allure now lay abandoned on the pedestal. The whispers had ceased, but the silence that followed was far more suffocating. She could feel the weight of unseen eyes upon her, as though the walls themselves had been listening, observing her every move. The museum, she now realized, was no mere building. It was a witness, a sentient entity that had been waiting for something. But what had it been waiting for? And why had she, of all people, been drawn into its depths? Her fingers still tingled from the book's touch, the memory of the vision she had experienced clinging to her like a second skin. She could no longer tell where the vision had ended and reality began. The faces from the past, the people she had seen in the portraits and the vision, seemed to linger at the edge of her consciousness, just out of reach. Were they real? Had they once walked these halls, as she now did? Or were they simply figments of the museum's twisted imagination, its attempt to keep the past alive? Despite the overwhelming sense of unease that gripped her, Elise could not shake the feeling that she had uncovered something important. The memory she had witnessed in the book, those faces, the figure that had reached out to her, had all been too vivid to ignore. It was as if the museum itself had chosen her, had guided her to this very moment. But why? Was there something she was meant to understand? Or was she just another in a long line of lost souls, doomed to wander these halls forever? The thought gnawed at her, and she knew that she could not leave without finding the answers. She couldn't just walk away from the mystery that had entangled her so thoroughly. Her footsteps echoed as she turned away from the alcove and continued deeper into the library, now feeling as though it were a maze with no end, its corridors shifting and rearranging to trap her within. The air was thick with dust and age, but it wasn't just the physical environment that felt decayed. The very fabric of time seemed to unravel here. The boundaries between what was real and what was imagined blurred beyond recognition. She found herself before another set of shelves, this time stacked with artifacts, ancient relics whose significance seemed to radiate off them. They were in glass cases, each carefully preserved, but Elise could sense that these objects, too, were not simply relics of the past. They held stories, memories of their own, and perhaps even more, a power that she couldn't fully comprehend. As she stood there, studying the objects, something caught her eye, an old pocket watch, resting in the center of the display, its face cracked, the hands frozen in place. It was almost as if the watch had been waiting for her. Drawn to it, Elise reached for the glass case, her hand trembling. She half expected the watch to disappear or the case to vanish into thin air, as though the museum were playing some cruel trick on her. But when she lifted the lid, there was no surprise. It was real, solid and cold beneath her fingertips. The watch itself seemed to pulse with an eerie energy, as though it had a life of its own, as if it was aware of her presence. As she picked it up, she noticed something strange. The weight was all wrong. It felt too heavy, almost as though it was burdened by something far greater than its physical form. She turned the watch over in her hand, examining it closely. On the back was an inscription, faded but legible enough for her to make out. To remember, to forget, to endure. The words sent a chill down her spine. What did they mean? Why would someone engrave such a cryptic message on something so seemingly ordinary? Elise felt an overwhelming compulsion to understand the message, to decipher its meaning, but the more she pondered it, the more the words seemed to slip from her grasp. Before she could continue her thoughts, the lights flickered, plunging the room into darkness for a split second. When the lights returned, Elise's surroundings had changed. The walls seemed to pulse with a faint, otherworldly glow, and the objects on the shelves no longer seemed as inert as they had before. She could almost feel their gaze, the collective stare of 1,000 forgotten souls. She wasn't alone here. She had never been alone. The museum was watching her, and it was waiting for something. With a start, Elise realized the significance of the inscription on the watch. To remember, to forget, to endure. It was a mantra, one that seemed to encapsulate the very essence of the museum. The people who had walked these halls, the ones whose faces she had seen in the vision, had all been bound by the same paradox. They had lived and died here, but their memories lingered. They had been forgotten by time, yet the museum refused to let them fade completely. It was a place that endured, holding on to the remnants of the past, forcing those who entered to confront what they had left behind. Suddenly, the realization hit her. The museum was not simply a collection of objects and artifacts. It was a place of memory, a place where the past refused to die, where the lives of those who had been forgotten were preserved, trapped in an endless loop of remembrance. And Elise was now part of it. She had become one of the forgotten ones, her memory already intertwined with the countless others who had come before her. Her thoughts were interrupted by a soft sound, a creaking, like the shifting of old wood. Elise's heart raced, and she turned, expecting to find the figure she had seen before. But there was no one there, yet the creaking continued, growing louder, closer. The museum seemed to breathe around her, its walls alive, shifting with a purpose she could not comprehend. As she stood there, rooted to the spot, Elise could feel the watch pulsing in her hand, its weight increasing, as if it was trying to tell her something. The museum was no longer just a place of forgotten memories. It was a living, breathing entity, and she had become part of its story. She had to make a choice: She could leave and try to forget what she had discovered, or she could stay and uncover the truth, no matter the cost. The path ahead was uncertain, but one thing was clear. There was no going back. The museum had claimed her, and she would endure. Elise had no choice but to press forward. The museum's oppressive silence seemed to tug at her, urging her to uncover more, to dive deeper into the hidden corners of its vast labyrinth. She gripped the pocket watch tightly, its weight now a constant reminder of her entanglement with this place. There was no turning back. The museum had already marked her as part of its strange, lingering existence. She could feel its ancient pulse, its heartbeat echoing through the floors and corridors. It was not merely a structure of brick and stone. It was a living thing, and Elise was now woven into its history, its memory. The corridor she walked through had grown even more perplexing. What had once seemed like a straightforward museum had transformed into an ever-shifting maze, with the walls bending and warping before her eyes. The layout felt fluid, as if the museum itself were reshaping its spaces to accommodate her. Elise's mind raced. She had read about places like this, where the architecture seemed to warp reality itself. Some called it a paradox, others a symptom of madness, but Elise knew better. The museum was not just twisting the physical space. It was manipulating time, memory, and perception. It was keeping secrets, old and dangerous ones, and Elise was now its unwilling keeper. As she wandered deeper into the heart of the museum, she came upon a darkened hallway. The air was thick, suffocating, and the light seemed to bend unnaturally around her. The walls were lined with mirrors, tall, narrow, and cracked, each one reflecting a twisted version of herself. Elise felt a chill crawl up her spine. She could hear faint whispers in the reflections, though they were inaudible in the air around her. They sounded like voices from the past, voices that had once lived within these halls, now trapped between the glass and the walls. They had become part of the museum, just like the artifacts, just like the stories embedded in the dust and forgotten corners. One of the mirrors caught her attention. Its frame was ornate, decorated with intricate designs that seemed to writhe and shift. Elise stepped closer, drawn by some inexplicable force. As she peered into its depths, her reflection flickered, distorting for a moment, and then the image in the mirror was no longer her own. It was a figure she had seen earlier in the book, one of the faces from the vision. A man, dressed in old-fashioned clothing, his expression mournful and distant. His eyes were locked on hers, and for a moment, Elise felt as though he could see directly into her soul. Before she could pull away, the man's lips moved, though no sound emerged. His mouth formed words, but they were drowned out by a loud, low hum that seemed to emanate from the mirror itself. Elise pressed her hands to her ears, trying to block out the noise, but it was impossible. The sound filled her mind, her very being. It was as if the museum was trying to communicate with her through the mirror, trying to convey something that she wasn't yet ready to understand. The walls seemed to close in around her, the air becoming thick with the oppressive presence of the museum, its memories swirling in the atmosphere like a storm. With a final, desperate tug, Elise turned away from the mirror, but the hum persisted, reverberating in the depths of her mind. She stumbled backward, her heart racing, her breath shallow. Her fingers still clutched the watch, which now seemed heavier than ever, as if it were drawing its power from the very air around her. She took a few steps down the hallway, but her body felt sluggish, as though the museum itself were slowing her down, holding her in place. At the end of the hallway, she found a door, weathered, its wood cracked and warped. It looked as though it had been untouched for centuries, yet there was something oddly familiar about it. The door seemed to beckon her, and without thinking, Elise reached for the handle. It turned easily in her hand, the wood creaking as she pushed it open. Beyond the door lay a room unlike any she had seen before. It was smaller than the grand halls, but its atmosphere was thick with an undeniable weight. The walls were covered in old photographs, black and white, each one showing a different face. Some were smiling, others grim, but all were staring out at her from the past. Elise stepped inside, the air feeling unnaturally cold. As she moved deeper into the room, she noticed that the photographs were not just ordinary portraits. They were slowly shifting, changing. Faces that had once been still were now moving, their expressions contorting into grotesque forms, as if trapped in a moment of intense emotion. Fear, sorrow, anger. They were all people who had once lived in the museum, but now their spirits seemed to be bound to the walls, their memories forever etched in these images. Suddenly, a voice broke the silence, a soft, distant whisper, so quiet it was almost imperceptible. It came from the corner of the room, where the shadows seemed to dance more than the rest of the room. Elise turned, her eyes scanning the darkness, but there was no one there. The whisper grew louder, clearer, though it remained distorted. It was calling her name. Elise! Her name echoed through the room, sending a shiver down her spine. She knew she was not alone, but it was impossible to tell where the voice was coming from. It seemed to come from all around her, from the very walls themselves, as if the museum had its own consciousness, its own voice. The portraits seemed to lean closer, their eyes fixed on her, as if urging her to listen. Elise! The whisper came again, more insistent this time. It was then that she realized the full weight of the situation. The museum was not merely a repository for the past. It was a prison for the forgotten ones, the lost souls whose memories had become part of its fabric. They were trapped here, caught between time and space, unable to move on. And now, Elise understood. She had been drawn into their world. The whispers, the visions, the shifting walls. They were all part of the museum's attempt to make her one of them, to bind her memory to this place so that she could never leave. But Elise could not allow that. She refused to be trapped in this endless loop of forgotten lives. She had to find a way to break free, to understand the truth behind the museum, to confront its dark secrets and the spirits it had bound to its walls. She had no choice. The museum had chosen her, but she would not let it claim her completely. Not yet, not without uncovering the truth. As Elise stood in the dimly lit room, surrounded by shifting faces, a new understanding began to take hold of her mind. The museum was more than just a collection of artifacts and relics from the past. It was a living entity, an entity that thrived on memory and time, feeding off the souls of those who had passed through its doors. The whispers were not just random echoes. They were the voices of those who had once walked these halls, their memories woven into the very structure of the museum. The portraits, the mirrors, and the disorienting corridors were all part of a complex web that connected the past and present, trapping the souls of those who had encountered it. And now, Elise had become entangled in that web. The room she stood in felt oppressive, as though the very air was thick with the weight of centuries. The walls, adorned with photographs, now seemed to pulse with life. Each face in the portraits twisted in agony, their eyes pleading for release, but there was no way out for them. And perhaps Elise thought there would be no way out for her either. She had already witnessed enough to know that the museum did not simply hold the past, it consumed it. The memories of the forgotten souls were its sustenance. She could feel the pull, the growing hunger within her. It was as if the museum were trying to siphon her very essence, to absorb her into its endless collection. But Elise was not ready to surrender. She could feel the weight of the pocket watch pressing against her palm, its cold surface grounding her, reminding her of the task at hand. The watch had come to symbolize her connection to the museum, but it was also the key, the link to the truth. She had no idea how, but she knew that she had to keep moving forward. The whispers, the shifting portraits, the oppressive atmosphere, they were all part of a larger puzzle, one she was determined to solve. She turned away from the room of photographs and pushed herself back into the hallway. The walls closed in on her, their surfaces rippling like liquid, as if the museum were alive and watching her every move. Elise fought the growing sense of panic that gripped her chest. The longer she stayed here, the more she felt the pull, the greater the pressure to become part of this place. She had to keep moving, keep uncovering the truth, or she would become one of the forgotten. The corridors seemed to stretch endlessly before her, twisting and turning in impossible directions. She had lost track of time. It felt as though hours had passed, though she had no way of knowing for sure. The museum had no real sense of time. Everything here was suspended in an eternal present, a moment that never truly passed. The walls were covered with strange symbols now, marks that seemed to shift as she moved, rearranging themselves before her eyes. It was as if the museum itself was alive, constantly changing, adapting, and shifting to suit its own needs. She paused for a moment, gathering her thoughts. There had to be something she was missing. The watch had to be more than just a symbol. It had to hold the answer. She examined it more closely now, its intricate design almost hypnotic in its complexity. The gears inside the watch clicked softly, almost as if responding to her attention. Could it be that the watch was not simply a key to the museum's past, but a means of navigating through it? Was it some kind of guide, a beacon that would lead her to the heart of the museum, the place where its power originated? With renewed determination, Elise set off again, her steps now more deliberate, more focused. She could feel the energy of the museum shifting around her, as if it were aware of her intentions. She was getting closer to something. She wasn't sure what it was, but there was a sense of inevitability in the air. She had been brought here for a reason, and now she was beginning to piece together that reason. The museum was a prison, a place of eternal memory and longing, but it was also a place of power, a place that could be manipulated. Elise was not just a victim here. She was a part of its story, and it was up to her to change that. The walls around her seemed to close in even further as she moved deeper into the museum. The hallways were narrowing, the air growing thicker with every step. The sound of her breathing echoed loudly in the silence. She couldn't shake the feeling that the museum was closing in on her, trapping her in its endless maze. But just as she thought she could go no further, she saw it. A door, old and weathered, standing at the end of a narrow hallway. It was a door unlike any she had seen before, intricately carved with symbols she did not recognize. It pulsed with a strange energy, as though it were alive, waiting for her. Elise approached the door cautiously, her heart pounding in her chest. She knew that behind it lay the answer, the truth she had been searching for. But she also knew that once she stepped through it, there would be no going back. The museum would claim her, or would let her go, but either way, she would not be the same. She hesitated for a moment, staring at the door, wondering what lay beyond. But then, with a deep breath, she reached for the handle and turned it. The door creaked open, and Elise stepped into the room beyond. The space inside was vast, larger than any room she had encountered in the museum before. It was filled with strange artifacts, ancient relics, books, and items that seemed to defy explanation. In the center of the room stood a large pedestal, upon which rested a glowing stone. The stone pulsed with an otherworldly energy, and as Elise approached, she could feel its power radiating through the air. She knew immediately that this was the heart of the museum, the source of its power. The stone was the key to everything, the source of its memory, its ability to trap souls, and the force that held the museum together. As Elise reached out to touch the stone, a voice echoed in her mind, a voice that was familiar yet distant, as though it were coming from the very walls themselves. "Elise, you shouldn't have come." The voice sent a jolt of fear through her, but she steadied herself. This was it. She had found the heart of the museum, and now she would uncover its secrets. The power in the stone called to her, its energy crackling in the air around her. She knew that her journey was far from over, but the answers were within her grasp. She could feel the museum's grip on her beginning to loosen. For the first time since she had entered, Elise felt like she had a chance to escape, to break free from the museum's endless cycle. But the question remained, would she be able to control the power, or would it consume her like it had consumed so many before her? Only time would tell. Elise's hand hovered just above the glowing stone. The hum of its energy vibrated through her fingertips, urging her to make the final step, to embrace whatever force lay within it. The room around her seemed to stretch further as she stood there, caught between the ancient power that beckoned her and the ominous voice that still echoed through her mind. She knew that this was the culmination of her journey, the point where the museum's dark grip would either tighten or release her. The question was not whether she could control the power of the stone, but whether she should. The voice from the walls, still distant but now urgent, whispered once again. "Elise, listen to me, you don't understand. It will consume you." There was a coldness in the voice now, as though it came from somewhere far more ancient and terrifying than the walls of the museum itself. It was not a warning. It was a plea, a desperate cry for her to retreat, to leave the stone untouched. But Elise stood frozen, her breath shallow as the energy in the room intensified. Every cell in her body felt as though it were being drawn toward the stone, as though her very essence was being called to it. Her mind screamed at her to pull away, but her body moved of its own accord, her fingers finally brushing the surface of the stone. The instant her skin made contact with it, a flash of light exploded in her vision, blinding her, sending her staggering backward. Her hand was now pulsing with the same light that emanated from the stone, as if the energy had transferred into her, anchoring her in place. She gasped for air, feeling as though her lungs had collapsed. The air in the room was thick, suffocating, pressing down on her chest. The walls of the museum seemed to twist and writhe around her, disorienting her, as though the building itself were alive and angry. Then, a voice much closer, now a scream, tore through her consciousness. "You've done it! You've freed us!" For a brief, terrifying moment, Elise thought she had made a grave mistake. The walls were closing in, the pulse of the stone now synchronizing with her heartbeat, quickening it. Was she losing herself? Was the stone overtaking her? The echoes of the trapped souls, the whispers that had guided and misled her through the labyrinth, all converged into one single, overwhelming force. Each pulse of energy from the stone seemed to fracture the air itself, causing the space around her to distort, bending reality. Her grip on the stone tightened involuntarily, her mind spinning as voices, countless voices, swirled in her ears. They were speaking in a language she could almost understand, words too ancient, too foreign to fully grasp, but their meaning was clear. This was no ordinary artifact. It was a conduit, a link to something beyond time. With a sudden force, Elise yanked her hand away from the stone, stumbling back. Her pulse raced as she fought to maintain control over her breathing. The stone, now silent, remained glowing in the center of the pedestal, its energy ebbing, as though it was waiting, watching her reaction. The room seemed less oppressive now, but the air was still charged, heavy with the weight of what had just transpired. Elise's heart continued to pound in her chest as she struggled to regain her composure. What had she unleashed? The voices still reverberated in her mind, but now they were not the whispers of lost souls. They were clearer, more insistent. They were no longer trapped in the walls of the museum. She had set them free, but at what cost? She felt a strange, unexplainable sense of both triumph and horror, as though she had opened a door to something that could not be closed again. The air around her began to shift. The energy in the room had changed. No longer was the museum a place of confinement, of stagnant history. It had become a conduit for something else. Elise felt it in her bones. The museum was no longer just a collection of artifacts. It was alive with possibility. The trapped souls, freed from their timeless prison, now roamed the museum's corridors, and Elise had become their unwitting catalyst. As she stepped back, looking around the vast room, she realized with a sickening clarity that her actions had irrevocably altered the balance. The stone had been a trap, yes, but it was also a gate. And now, the museum was no longer just a museum. It was a battlefield, a place where the boundaries between the living and the dead were no longer clearly defined. Elise stumbled back into the hallway, her senses reeling. The museum seemed quieter now, though there was an underlying hum in the air, a constant vibration that set her teeth on edge. The walls, once so oppressively silent, now seemed to breathe, expanding and contracting like the chest of a living creature. The once still portraits seemed to shift, their eyes now following her as she passed. The footsteps she heard behind her were not her own. Someone or something was walking with her. The museum had become a maze of shifting dimensions, a realm where the dead walked alongside the living, and the boundaries between the two were no longer clear. Elise had inadvertently broken the seal that had kept the spirits trapped, but she had also unlocked a door that could not be closed. There was no turning back now. With trembling hands, Elise clutched the pocket watch in her palm, the cold metal grounding her, reminding her of the task that lay ahead. She could not let the spirits remain free to roam, unchecked, within the museum. There was still a way to set things right, to restore the balance, but she had to confront whatever forces now held sway over the museum's power. And as she moved deeper into the shifting labyrinth, a new realization dawned on her. The museum itself had not been her captor, it had been her test. She had been chosen, not to free the spirits, but to stop them, to undo the damage she had caused. The truth, she now understood, was far darker than she could have ever imagined. The museum had always been a place of power, hidden, waiting for the right person to unlock its true purpose. Elise was that person. The question now was whether she would be the savior, or the final soul to be consumed by the museum's endless hunger. Elise walked deeper into the labyrinthine corridors of the museum, her senses heightened. The walls, once passive in their silence, now seemed to pulse with a strange life of their own. The temperature had dropped, the chill in the air wrapping around her like a suffocating cloak. Every corner she turned felt familiar, yet foreign, as if the museum itself had become something else, something that was actively reshaping itself in response to the release of the trapped souls. There was no telling where the passageways began or ended anymore. The museum was alive, and it was watching her every move. It was impossible to ignore the feeling that something was following her. Every time she paused, she could hear the subtle creak of old wood beneath unseen footsteps, the whisper of breath against her ear. But when she turned, there was nothing there. She had seen the shadows in the corners of her vision, flickering just beyond her sight line. But when she focused on them, they vanished. It was as though the spirits of the museum, now freed from their prison, were stalking her, waiting for her to make the wrong move. Her fingers brushed the walls as she walked, tracing the faded paintings and artifacts that seemed to have shifted in meaning since she last passed by. The eyes in the portraits were no longer painted with the same passive expressions they had held before. Now, they watched her, unblinking, with a knowing look that suggested they understood the consequences of her actions. Elise felt a sudden pang of guilt, a sensation that had begun to grow in her chest ever since she made contact with the stone. She hadn't meant to release them, hadn't realized what she was doing until it was too late. But there was no time for regret now. As she made her way through the twisting hallways, the whispers around her grew louder, more distinct. They were calling to her, urging her to follow. Her breath hitched as the voice she had heard before echoed again in her mind. "Elise, you have freed us, but you do not know the cost." She tried to block out the voice, but it persisted, slithering into her thoughts, wrapping around her mind like a serpent. The walls groaned under the weight of the voice, and for a moment, she thought the entire building might collapse in on itself. She shook her head, pushing the voice aside. She had made a choice, and now she had to face the consequences. But what exactly had she set in motion? Turning a corner, Elise stumbled into a room she didn't recognize. The air was thick with dust, and the light from her flashlight flickered in the corner of her eye. It was an exhibition room, but it didn't match anything she had seen before. The objects in the room were warped, twisted in ways that defied logic. A sculpture of a horse, its body bent unnaturally backward, stood in one corner. A painting, seemingly out of place in this time, depicted a dark sky raining down what looked like molten lava, while a small group of figures stood on the horizon, their faces blurred beyond recognition. A strange chill settled over her as she realized this room didn't belong in the museum. It was as if it had manifested out of the void. As she moved forward, her foot caught on something hidden beneath the floorboards. She knelt to investigate, her fingers brushing a cold, metallic object. It was a key, a heavy, ornate thing, shaped like a serpent coiled around a twisted piece of metal. Elise stared at it for a long moment, her mind racing. Was this part of the museum's design? Or had it appeared only after the stone's power had been unleashed? She didn't know, but she knew one thing for certain. The key was important. Before she could get a better grip on it, the ground beneath her feet groaned, and the room seemed to shift again. The walls closed in, and the paintings seemed to flicker in and out of existence. Elise's heart raced as she heard the unmistakable sound of footsteps approaching. Heavy, deliberate, and unyielding. She knew she was no longer alone in this room. The shadows around her grew darker, darker than the darkness itself, as if they were alive, seeking to consume her. Her grip tightened around the key as she stood, backing away from the shadows that seemed to stretch toward her. The air grew thicker, almost suffocating, and she could feel her skin crawling with an unseen presence. She wasn't just being followed anymore. She was being hunted. From the corner of her eye, she saw something, or rather, someone standing at the far end of the room. It was a figure, tall and thin, cloaked in tattered rags. Its face was obscured by shadows, but its eyes glowed faintly, a pale blue that sent a jolt of fear through Elise. She froze, unable to look away. The figure's mouth opened, but no sound came out. Instead, she heard the voice from before, the one that had guided her here, now twisted and distorted. Elise, you have released us, but you must now face what you have awoken. You cannot undo what has been done. It is too late. The figure advanced slowly, deliberately, as if it were moving through thick, invisible water. Elise felt the weight of its gaze pressing into her, pinning her in place. The air around her seemed to ripple, distorting the space between them as though reality itself were bending under the figure's power. The whispers in the room grew louder, the voices of the spirits now almost deafening, overlapping in their urgency. "Elise, run," one voice screamed. "It's coming for you. Don't let it take you too." But Elise could not move. The figure was too close now, its form growing clearer with each step. There was a gaping void where its face should be, nothing but blackness and swirling shadows. It reached out toward her with skeletal hands, its fingers elongating as though they were trying to grasp her very soul. For a moment, time seemed to freeze. Elise held her breath, staring into the abyss of the figure's face, trying to understand what it wanted, what it was. She thought she could hear the faintest sound of something like a heartbeat beneath the roar of the spirits, slow and steady, like the beating of something ancient, something that had been dormant for far too long. And then, in an instant, the figure's hands were upon her, and everything went dark. The darkness that enveloped Elise felt oppressive, as though the very fabric of reality had been pulled away, leaving her suspended in an endless void. She could no longer feel the key in her hand, nor the cold floor beneath her feet. There was only a suffocating emptiness, broken only by the distant echoes of whispered voices. They were the same voices she had heard before, but now they felt closer, almost as though they were inside her mind, gnawing at her thoughts. Her breathing was shallow, the weight of her chest a reminder that she was still alive, yet in a state of profound disconnection. There was no sense of time here, no beginning, no end, only a sense of lost purpose. For the first time since she had stepped into the museum, Elise felt truly helpless. She had always believed that in the face of horror, one could fight back, or at least escape. But this was different. The rules of her reality no longer applied. The presence of the figure, the being that had followed her into the room, still lingered in the air, its intentions clear but impossible to understand. Elise's mind was foggy, overwhelmed by the weight of the unseen forces pressing down on her. She could hear it breathing, or perhaps it was the sound of her own breath, amplified by the silence surrounding her. But the voices began to intensify once again. "Elise, Elise, you have awakened us. Now you will join us." Her eyes snapped open. She wasn't sure if she had been asleep, or if she had simply lost her bearings in the overwhelming darkness. But there was light now, faint, flickering light, like the dying embers of a once mighty fire. She was lying on cold stone, her hands pressed against the uneven surface. Slowly, she pushed herself up, her mind racing, her pulse quickening. Her body felt heavy, sluggish, as though it had been drained of all energy. It was then that she realized she was no longer in the museum. The surroundings were different, unfamiliar. She was in some sort of chamber, its walls covered in strange, cryptic markings, none of which she could decipher. The stone was old, crumbling at the edges, and the air smelled damp, as though it had not been disturbed for centuries. Elise could feel the weight of the place, its history, its purpose, settling on her shoulders. As she stood, her legs wobbled beneath her, and she had to steady herself against the wall. There was an oppressive sense of being watched here, too, not by the spirits of the museum, but by something else, something far older and far more sinister. She could almost hear its whispers, faint but unmistakable, as though the walls themselves were alive, murmuring in the dark. "Elise!" The voice came again, but this time it was not the same as before. It was lower, deeper, resonating within her chest rather than her mind. She turned toward the sound, and there, emerging from the shadows at the far end of the chamber, stood the figure. It was not just an apparition this time. It was real, tangible, its form more solid, more defined. It stepped forward, its long, bony fingers curling around the edges of the stone as it moved closer to her. It was no longer a faceless specter. Now, its face was visible, though still obscured by darkness. The features were faintly human, yet distorted in unnatural ways. The eyes glowed with a pale, unearthly light, and its mouth, when it opened, revealed rows of jagged teeth, like those of some long-forgotten predator. "Elise," the figure crooned, its voice a low, guttural sound. "You have entered the place where the threads of reality unravel. You have set in motion what cannot be stopped." The chamber seemed to react to its presence, the walls trembling slightly as if in acknowledgement of its power. Elise's heart raced in her chest, her legs trembling beneath her. She wanted to run, to escape this nightmare, but the very air around her felt thick, as though it was holding her in place, preventing any movement. The figure's gaze locked onto her, its eyes burning with an intensity that made her blood run cold. She had to understand. She had to know what this place was, why she was here, and how it all tied back to the museum. Her mind spun in circles, grasping for answers, but none seemed to come. Every thought was clouded by the overwhelming presence of the figure. There was a growing certainty in her mind, a feeling that this was the heart of it all, the true center of the museum's curse. Whatever had been released by the stone was connected to this place, to this figure, to the ancient power that had remained dormant for so long. "You are part of the puzzle, Elise," the figure continued, its voice no longer just a sound, but a force reverberating through the chamber. "You are the key to the unraveling, the last thread that holds this place together. When you freed us, you didn't just release us from the stone. You tore down the veil between worlds. Now the boundaries are gone. Reality is fraying, and soon, nothing will remain but the void." Her heart pounded harder now. The weight of its words sank in like a heavy stone, pressing down on her chest. The museum, the artifacts, the spirits, it was all connected to this place, to this moment. The figure, or whatever it was right. She had unwittingly opened a door that could not be closed. There was no going back. The world she had known was disintegrating, and in its place was something far darker, far more malevolent. The figure moved closer still, its presence growing more suffocating with each step. Elise could feel the pull of its power, the coldness of its touch as it reached out to her, its skeletal hand closing around her wrist. And in that moment, she understood. She wasn't just a witness to this unraveling. She was its catalyst. The museum, the stone, the spirits, they had all been waiting for her to release the ancient force that had been locked away. The room grew darker still, the shadows crawling toward her as if they were alive, and she realized with horror that there was no escape. Not anymore. As Elise stood, paralyzed by the figure's grip, she could feel the world shifting once again around her. The stone walls of the chamber seemed to pulse with a life of their own, a deep, resonant thrum that vibrated through her very bones. It was as if the entire structure, the very foundation of this place, was being reconfigured by some unseen force. The air felt heavier, thicker, suffused with an ancient energy that grew more oppressive with every breath she took. This was not just a place lost in time. It was a space that defied time itself. The figure, whose touch was colder than the depths of the sea, tightened its grip around her wrist, and Elise could feel a strange, tingling sensation running up her arm. It was as though the figure's touch was not just physical, but invasive, something that reached into her mind, her very essence, trying to unravel who she was. The darkness around her deepened, and she could feel the edges of her consciousness starting to fray, as if it were being pulled into the void. "You don't understand, Elise," the figure whispered, its voice now both soothing and terrifying, like the hum of a distant storm on the horizon. "You are not just the key to the unraveling. You are the thread itself. The stone, the museum, they have all been waiting for you to come, to awaken what has been slumbering for eons. You were meant to release us, to tear down the veil that separates our world from yours." The words echoed in her mind, and for the briefest moment, Elise felt a flicker of recognition. It was as though her memories had momentarily fractured, and she saw glimpses of something, an ancient, forgotten ritual, a dark force hidden within the walls of the museum, an entity trapped in the stone. But these images vanished as quickly as they came, leaving only a lingering sense of dread. She tried to focus, to remember, but the figure's grip tightened, and the world around her seemed to blur. Her heart pounded in her chest as she struggled against the hold, her mind desperately trying to make sense of the surreal and terrifying experience. There was a sensation of deep, raw fear, an instinctive, primal dread that told her she was in the presence of something not only ancient but malevolent. The figure before her was not simply an entity. It was a manifestation of the museum's dark history, a being that had existed before the museum, before the stone, and perhaps even before time itself. "Well, what do you want from me?" Elise gasped, her voice weak but determined. The figure's eyes, pale, luminescent, and ancient, glinted with a cruel satisfaction. It seemed almost pleased by her confusion, as though her fear fed it. "You are our bridge. Without you, the veil cannot fall. Without you, the stone remains in its prison. The museum remains locked in its prison of time. You are here to help us move beyond the boundaries of this place, to step into your world." Elise recoiled inwardly. The idea that she was some kind of bridge between worlds was too much to comprehend. How could she, how could anyone, be the key to such a dreadful, unfathomable change? She had merely come to the museum out of curiosity, and now she was trapped in a nightmare far worse than any she had imagined. The weight of this revelation settled over her like a shroud, suffocating her spirit. The museum was no longer just a collection of artifacts. It was a nexus of dark, cosmic forces, and she was at its center. "You are part of something much bigger than yourself," the figure continued, its voice growing deeper, more resonant. "You have touched what should never have been touched. Now the pieces are set in motion, and there is no stopping them. The boundaries between our world and yours are thinning. Soon, the worlds will merge, and nothing will remain. You must choose, Elise. Choose." Elise's voice broke, a wave of panic rising within her chest. "Choose what?" The figure's smile was cruel, its teeth gleaming like those of a predator. "You must decide whether to let the worlds collide, to bring everything together, or you must sacrifice yourself to repair the breach you've caused. Only one can survive, the worlds or you." Elise staggered back, her breath coming in sharp, desperate gasps. She felt the weight of the decision pressing down on her, suffocating her in a way that no physical force could. There was no easy choice. Let the worlds collide, and all of reality would unravel. Sacrifice herself, and she would close the breach but lose everything. Her life, her future, and the very essence of her being. There was no way to know which choice would truly save anyone. In her mind, the paths were equally terrifying. But as the figure stepped forward, something changed in the air. The temperature dropped sharply, and Elise felt a sudden chill run down her spine. The figure seemed to flicker, like a shadow caught between two planes of existence, its form warping and twisting. For a moment, Elise was unsure whether it was the figure's power causing the shift in reality or something far darker, far more powerful, that had begun to take notice of her. She could feel it, a presence, darker and more ancient than anything she had encountered before. The voice from the figure became strained, almost desperate. "Do not delay. The time has come." Elise's thoughts raced. She had no answers, no plan, no hope left. She was standing at the precipice of something beyond her comprehension, trapped between two worlds. The weight of what she had done, of what she was about to face, pressed down on her like a 1,000-pound stone. The figure's words reverberated in her mind. The time has come. But for what? What was the true cost of her actions? As the last of her resolve shattered, Elise closed her eyes and took a deep breath. In that moment, she knew one thing. Whatever she chose, she could not stand still, not for one more second. The world, her world, was slipping through her fingers, and she could feel the darkness closing in. Elise's mind was in turmoil as she stood frozen at the crossroads between two unimaginable futures. The figure in front of her loomed, its presence like an insidious weight pressing down on her chest. And for a moment, she was paralyzed by the sheer magnitude of the decision she had to make. There was no right path. There was only a precipice, a choice that would determine whether reality itself would unravel. She was no longer just an observer. She had become an unwilling participant in something far larger than herself. The museum, once a place of curiosity and history, had transformed into a prison, a boundary between realms. Every artifact, every piece of history that had been carefully curated and displayed was now a part of this ominous nexus. The air crackled with energy, a low hum that seemed to resonate from deep within the earth, reverberating through the stone and into her bones. The boundaries between the past and present, between the living and the forgotten, were dissolving before her eyes. The figure stepped closer, its form shimmering like a mirage. "You must decide, Elise. The fabric of time and space is at your fingertips. You hold the fate of both our worlds in your hands." Its voice was both seductive and terrifying, drawing her in with the promise of ultimate power and forcing her to confront the horror of what she had inadvertently awakened. Elise felt a cold sweat break out across her skin, her body trembling with the knowledge that her every move from here on would have consequences beyond her understanding. But as the figure continued to speak, something inside Elise shifted. A quiet defiance, a strength that had long been buried beneath her fear, began to rise. She had always prided herself on her independence, on her ability to face the unknown with curiosity and courage. This moment was no different. She refused to let herself be consumed by this ancient force, no matter how powerful it was. She had to find another way. There had to be a way to stop this madness without sacrificing herself or the world she knew. With a deep breath, Elise turned away from the figure, her eyes searching the room for any sign of an escape. The museum, with its labyrinthine corridors and shadowed hallways, no longer felt like a place of refuge. It was a trap, but somewhere, buried within the dark recesses of this ancient place, there had to be something that could help her. Perhaps there was a way to undo the damage, to sever the connection between the realms before it was too late. The figure's laughter echoed through the room, harsh and mocking. "You think you can escape this, Elise? You're already bound to us. The moment you crossed the threshold of this museum, you sealed your fate." Its voice grew more insistent, more forceful, as though it was trying to push her toward the inevitable. "There is no running. The time for choices is past. The world is already unraveling." Elise refused to listen. She pressed on, her heart pounding, her mind racing. She knew the figure was right in one sense. There was no running, no hiding from the truth. But there was one thing she could still control: her will. Her choices had led her here, and they would lead her out. She wasn't just a tool in this cosmic game. She was a person with the capacity to change things, to fight back. Her search led her to a dusty corner of the room, where an old, tarnished door stood, hidden behind a curtain of ivy. It seemed out of place in the otherwise sterile environment of the museum, its wood warped and covered with the patina of age. For a fleeting moment, Elise hesitated. Was this another illusion? Another trap set by the figure to lure her deeper into the museum's grip? Or was this the path to freedom? Without another thought, she pushed open the door. It creaked on its hinges, as though it hadn't been disturbed in centuries. Beyond it, a narrow staircase spiraled downward into the dark. Elise stepped into the abyss, her heart racing, her senses heightened. This was no ordinary escape route. It was a descent into the unknown, a place where the very laws of reality seemed to bend and twist. The air grew colder as she descended, and the shadows pressed closer, as if the very walls were alive, reaching out to grab her. But Elise didn't falter. She kept her mind focused, her resolve firm. If this path led her to the heart of the museum, to the source of whatever darkness had taken root here, then she would face it head-on. There was no turning back now. At the bottom of the staircase, Elise found herself in a vast, underground chamber. It was larger than any room she had yet seen, its walls covered with strange symbols, etchings that seemed to pulse with an energy all their own. The room was empty, save for an altar in the center, its surface covered with ancient relics. Elise felt a sudden wave of recognition wash over her. A memory from her childhood, from a long-forgotten dream, flickered to life. She had seen this place before, or something very like it. This was it, the heart of the museum, the source of the dark power that had ensnared her. As she approached the altar, the ground beneath her feet trembled, and the symbols on the walls began to glow with an eerie light. It was as if the room itself was coming alive, responding to her presence, to her awakening. Elise knew this was the point of no return. Whatever decision she made here would echo through the corridors of time, affecting both worlds in ways she couldn't yet comprehend. She reached out to touch the altar, her fingers trembling. The moment she made contact, the room seemed to explode in a rush of sound and light. And for an instant, she was overwhelmed by the sensation of falling through endless layers of time and space. Reality itself seemed to bend, folding over her, and she was caught in a whirlpool of sensations and memories. Memories of lives she had never lived, of worlds she had never known. But just as quickly as it had begun, it stopped. Elise found herself standing back in the room, gasping for air, her mind reeling. She was no longer alone. The figure stood before her, its form now fully materialized, no longer a mere shadow, but a being of flesh and bone, its eyes burning with an otherworldly fire. "You have crossed the point of no return," it said, its voice low and rumbling. "The worlds are already beginning to merge. It is too late to turn back." Elise stood frozen before the figure, her breath coming in shallow gasps as the weight of its words settled over her. The reality of what had just happened, the very act of touching the altar, of crossing the threshold between worlds, had irrevocably altered the course of everything. It was as though she had opened a door to a place where no rules applied, where time and space were not linear, and the impossible could unfold at will. Yet, the presence of the figure, now more solid than before, confirmed that the true horror was not just the physical manifestation of the museum's curse, but the deeper forces that now stirred. The figure stepped closer, its presence overwhelming. It was no longer the vague, shadowy entity that had whispered from the corners of her mind. Now, it stood fully formed, towering over her like an ancient god, eyes burning with an intensity that made her skin crawl. Elise could sense that this being, this force, was beyond mortal comprehension, far older, far more powerful than she could ever have imagined. And yet, despite the terror she felt, there was a flicker of something else deep within her, a resolve that refused to yield. "You have done it," the figure intoned, its voice a blend of triumph and malice. The veil between worlds is thinner now, more fragile. We are so close to the end. All that remains is to let the worlds collide, to weave the fabric of reality into something new, something unrecognizable. Elise fought to steady her mind, her heart pounding in her chest. She had always known, deep down, that this day would come. There had been moments, fleeting and intangible, when she had sensed that the museum held secrets far darker than she had ever believed. But now, standing on the precipice of disaster, she wondered whether her curiosity, her endless desire to uncover the past, had led her to this moment of reckoning. Could she really stop what had already begun? "You don't understand," she said, her voice trembling but strong. This isn't right. I won't let you do this." The figure's laugh echoed through the room, an unsettling sound that reverberated off the stone walls. "You think you can stop what has already been set into motion? You are merely a pawn in this game, Elise. Your actions, your choices, they were always part of the plan. The museum has chosen you. You are its key." At those words, Elise's mind reeled. She had always felt as if the museum had been more than just a building, more than a collection of artifacts. There was something alive about it, something that pulsed with an energy she couldn't quite explain. But now, in this moment, she realized the truth. The museum was not merely a witness to history. It was an active participant in the events unfolding. It had manipulated her from the very beginning, drawing her in with its mysteries, guiding her steps toward this final confrontation. "No," she whispered, her eyes widening as she understood. "This was never about me. It was about the museum, the power it contains. It was using me to open the door." The figure nodded slowly, as though Elise had finally come to the realization it had been waiting for. "Yes, you have become the conduit for its will. But now, you must choose. Will you allow the worlds to merge, to erase the boundaries between them? Or will you defy the will of the museum, the very force that created you and brought you here?" The weight of the decision pressed heavily upon Elise's shoulders. If she rejected the merging of worlds, if she chose to stop the chaos, she would be going up against something far greater than herself, something that had existed long before she was born and would persist long after she was gone. The idea of fighting the museum itself, of standing against the force that had shaped her destiny, seemed impossible. But the alternative, allowing the worlds to merge, was even worse. She could sense it, the unraveling of reality, the breaking down of everything she knew. The fabric of time itself would tear apart, creating a world where nothing made sense, where history would be lost in a spiral of distortion. "Tell me," she demanded, her voice shaking with a mixture of fear and determination. "What happens if the worlds merge? What does that look like?" The figure regarded her with a cold, calculating expression. "It is not something that can be described in simple terms. The merging will collapse time, reshape existence. Past, present, and future will become a tangled mess, and history will no longer be a linear progression. What was once fixed in the timeline will become fluid. Nothing will be permanent. Everything you know will be forgotten, and everything you fear will become real. The boundaries between the living and the dead will dissolve, and all things will become one." Elise's heart skipped a beat. The vision the figure painted was nothing short of apocalyptic. If the museum succeeded in its plan, it would unleash chaos on an unimaginable scale. The consequences were too dire to fathom. Yet, the mere thought of confronting the figure, of defying its power, filled her with dread. How could she fight something so ancient, so powerful? What hope did one person have against a force that had shaped the course of history? Her mind flashed back to the altar, to the moment she had touched it. She remembered the sensation of falling, of being pulled into something beyond her comprehension. Perhaps that was the key. Perhaps the altar was more than just a trigger. It might hold the power to stop the merging, to seal the rift between worlds. But she had no idea how to activate it, how to use its power. The figure was watching her, its eyes burning with an intensity that seemed to bore into her very soul. Elise felt the pressure building, the walls closing in around her. There was no time left for hesitation. "Do it, Elise," the figure whispered, its voice barely audible, yet somehow omnipresent. "Make your choice." Elise closed her eyes, took a deep breath, and felt the stirring of something deep within her. It wasn't just fear she felt now. It was resolve. She had been drawn into this nightmare, yes, but she would not be its pawn. She would not allow the world to be consumed by this monstrous force. She would find a way to end this, to stop the merging of worlds. With every ounce of her will, Elise stepped forward, moving toward the altar once more. The figure moved to stop her, but she pushed forward, feeling the pulse of the room intensify as she neared her goal. This was it. She had no more time for doubt. This was her last chance to make a difference. As her hand hovered over the altar, a final, dreadful thought crossed her mind. Would it be enough? Or had she already lost? The air around Elise had grown thick with tension, each moment stretching into eternity as she hovered over the altar. The figure loomed before her, its presence oppressive, as though it were a weight pressing down on her chest. The walls of the museum seemed to pulse with the same rhythm as her heart, a relentless beat that spoke of inevitability. Every choice she had made, every action she had taken, had led her here, to this moment. And yet, despite the terrifying magnitude of what she faced, Elise felt a strange calm within herself. She was no longer the uncertain woman who had walked into the museum all those weeks ago, seeking answers. She was now something else, something forged in the crucible of fear and revelation. The figure, sensing her resolve, stepped closer, its form shimmering in the dim light. "Do you truly believe you can stop it?" it asked, its voice now a low, mocking whisper. "You cannot undo what has been set into motion. The fabric of reality is already torn. The worlds will collide, and there is nothing you can do to prevent it." Elise's eyes narrowed as she focused on the altar. Her mind raced through the fragmented memories of the past, of the strange objects, the whispered voices, and the sense of being manipulated by forces beyond her control. The museum had always been more than it appeared. It had always been a living entity, feeding off the stories of the past, weaving them into a tapestry of power. And now, Elise understood. The altar, the objects, the cursed relics. All of them were part of something far greater, something ancient and unfathomable. But she had learned something else in her journey. Nothing was truly inevitable. There was always a choice, a way to defy fate. With a deep breath, Elise let her fingers brush against the cold surface of the altar. The moment she made contact, the room seemed to shift. The air grew heavy, and the very walls seemed to bend and warp, as though reality itself was warping around her. For a brief moment, she could see the edges of time itself unraveling, the threads of history twisting in unnatural directions. Past and future collided in a kaleidoscope of confusion, and Elise felt herself slipping, losing her grip on the world she had known. But then, a clarity washed over her. She wasn't just touching the altar, she was connecting with something much deeper, something primal. The power of the museum was not in its artifacts or in the dark forces it had harnessed, but in the stories it contained. Stories had the power to shape reality. They could be twisted, rewritten, or even erased entirely. Elise had seen how the museum distorted the past, how it manipulated the present, and now she realized she had the ability to rewrite the ending of this tale, to choose a new narrative. The figure's voice became a low growl, a sound of frustration and rage. "You cannot rewrite history, Elise. It is too late. You will fail, just like all the others who came before you." But Elise was no longer afraid. She had faced the horrors of the museum and come to understand its true nature. It was not the museum that held the power. It was the stories it contained, and by extension, the people who shaped them. She was not merely a pawn in this game. She was the storyteller. And every story, no matter how twisted or dark, could be changed. With renewed determination, Elise closed her eyes and began to speak. Her words were not of defiance or anger, but of understanding. She spoke of balance, of the delicate dance between the realms of the living and the dead. She spoke of the importance of memory, of how the past shaped the present, but how it should not dictate the future. As she spoke, she felt the altar beneath her hands begin to tremble, the force of her words rippling through the very fabric of reality. The figure howled in fury, its form flickering and shifting, as though it were being torn apart by the force of Elise's will. "No," it screamed. "You cannot do this." But Elise did not waver. The museum, the figure, the entire dark history it had woven, they all began to disintegrate, collapsing under the weight of the new narrative she was creating. The power of the altar no longer belonged to the ancient forces that had sought to control it. It belonged to her, and with it, she rewrote the ending of this story. The museum, with all its twisted relics and dark secrets, began to fade away like a forgotten dream. The ground beneath Elise's feet trembled violently, but she stood firm. The walls of the museum cracked and crumbled, their ancient stones disintegrating into dust. The relics, once so powerful, dissolved into nothingness, their dark influence fading like shadows at dawn. And as the figure let out a final, ear-piercing scream, it too was consumed by the force of the new story being told. As the dust settled, Elise stood alone in the silence. The museum was gone. The curse had been broken, the balance restored. But there was no triumphant victory, no loud cheers or applause. There was only the quiet realization that the fight was over. She had won, but at a great cost. The past, the present, and the future had been forever altered, and Elise was left to reckon with the consequences of her choices. She stepped outside the crumbling ruins of the museum, the sun shining brightly overhead. The world seemed unchanged, yet Elise knew better. Everything had shifted, and though the darkness had been vanquished, she felt the weight of the story she had freed. They would live on, reshaped, rewritten, and somewhere, in the vast tapestry of existence, new stories would begin to unfold. Elise had played her part, but the world, now free from the grip of the museum's curse, would continue to spin. The end of one story marked the beginning of another. And so, she walked away, carrying the weight of the past with her, ready to face whatever the future would bring.